amplification. Okay, well, we're into a different part of discussing it. Like I said, for those that haven't been here all along, we're talking really from a standpoint of a New Testament survey to look at the environment, and then looking at applications that Paul has talked about, or Peter's talked about, or Matthew's talked about in the Bible. So, this week, if I turn it on, it's about the society and the classes in the society, and how that's reflected in what was written in the scriptures. So, this is what I went through a lot of different sites to look through and find out where I could find the information as far as the different parts, the different classes in Roman society, overall in Roman. And the smallest, I believe, were the senatorial. Kind of makes sense because that was people who were in the Senate or had been in the Senate. Those were considered senatorial. Equites. Equites were the people who were worth more than 50,000 denarii. And I'm going to go a little bit more into that, but they're rich. Ordinary citizens, which came with all of the citizen rights you had as a citizen, represents about 10%. Not a lot. Freed slaves, slaves kind of went into two categories. Slaves and then the libertini who had been freed slaves. And the libertini were usually the slaves that had been educated, and they were the bureaucrats in society, which is kind of interesting. But most of the people fell into the peregrini. That was most of the empire. So the dominant class of Roman society, I asked that one, I just answered that one, the peregrini. So which classes were Roman citizens? No. Senates?
Senatorial and the ordinary citizens?
And the ordinary citizens and the equites.
Okay.
Those three were Roman citizens, had all the rights and privileges for Romans. So which classes were the rich class, which ones were the middle class, and which ones were the poor? They were rich. I've got a couple things that goes into a little bit more, but you see the small percents, senatorial and the equites, they would have been the ones that would have been normally the rich. The libertini were freed slaves, and the ordinary citizens probably were the middle class. And then there was a mix in the peregrini. And you would say the slaves would be poor. They were property. From a Roman standpoint, they were property. So which classes were the Jews a part of? Mostly the peregrini, but did they fall into any other classes?
Well, Paul was a Roman citizen, so they're...
Paul was a Roman citizen, so they would fall into the ordinary citizens, the peregrini, and there may have been some that were taken as slaves. Don't know.
Might be fine, so we said the tax collector, like Zacchaeus, who seemed to be a rich guy, a rich young ruler, they may find that into the equites or whatever too.
No, he wasn't. You had to be a citizen to be an equite.
That's true. Okay. I didn't know that.
You had to be a citizen. And you'll see there's a relationship between two of those classes that I'm going to talk about.
Were the freed slaves, were any of those citizens?
If they bought their citizenship, they could have been.
Okay.
Or they could have served in the reserve. But if they were a bureaucrat, I don't know whether they made them normally a citizen. They still were under the direction of usually the senatorial or the equites. And I'll talk about that. Which class was Jesus in? Peregrini.
Yeah.
So I'll talk a little bit more about them. The senatorial, senators and their immediate family, and I would imagine a retired senator as well. It was forbidden from personally engaging in commerce above a certain value. So they got around it by paying the next class down, the equites. They had them do it for it. They became governors, generally occupied the very top roles of government. This class and the equites were referred to as the patricians in the early days of the Republic. And the equites is kind of a shortening of equestrians. And they were the ones, the soldiers that were cavalrymen. Well, if you had a horse, you had some money. But the net worth of 50,000 denarii, I went through denarii is a day's wages. If you put it in terms of ours, and a minimum wage of $15 an hour, 8 hours a day, a day's wage is $120. Therefore, 50,000 times 120 is $6 million. So you had to at least be worth $6 million to be in this class. That's why it's pretty small. High-ranking military and civilian positions in the empire, so they would have been, some of the generals would have been equites. Vespasian, and Titus, who razed Jerusalem to the ground, would have been equites. So, but what requirement do both the senatorials and equites have to meet? They had to be Roman citizens. Ordinary citizens, they could serve in the legions, had certain rights. So you could be a soldier if you were an ordinary citizen, which is kind of interesting. They had the right not to be tortured, the right to freely conduct commerce, the right to prosecute or defend oneself or others in legal trials. They had the right to vote. Any legitimate child born to a citizen was considered a citizen. Women were considered citizens, but they couldn't vote. This class in the early days of the Republic was referred to as the plebeians. We hear more about the plebeians, we do hear about the aristocrats. And the Peregrini, non-citizens of the empire, usually living in the provinces. That was how the Roman Empire really expanded out. And those people they expanded out to were not Roman citizens, unless, I'll get to it in a second, they couldn't intermarry with citizens except without government permission. Otherwise, if they had children, they would not be recognized because they didn't have the government position. They could serve in the auxiliary units to the legions, but not in the legions. And if they were in there for 25 years, they could earn their citizenship. What's the distinction between a man and woman citizen? The vote. How could Paul have been born as an ordinary citizen if he was Jewish?
Isn't Jewish to be Jewish is your lineage?
It is your lineage, but how'd the Jews feel about the Romans? They hated them. Well, it was a responsibility of the father and as well as the mother to tell them the stories and the Bible and everything like that and keep them up to speed on that. So I saw very much both of them involved, was been my experience, and I suspect it would have been like that then. He was born in Tarsus, right? Tarsus is in present-day Turkey, I believe. I don't think it's in Syria. I think it's in Turkey. And it was in part of the empire. So one of his parents had to be Jewish. And they got permission to marry. And that is how Paul became a citizen of Rome and a Pharisee among Pharisees.
Would that marriage be looked down upon normally?
Excuse me?
Would that marriage be looked down upon normally, a Roman and a Jewish person getting married?
It probably could be to some extent. They could look at that and say, but But there was a lot of people that were in the Peregrini. And if you were a Roman soldier, you were a citizen, you could see where a lot of that could happen, where you would have to get the approval, but a lot of that would happen. But it's interesting, which makes me think it might have been the father more than the mother, but I'm not sure, that Paul was raised at the feet and taught at the feet of Gamaliel. I think I said it right, which was a teacher, a renowned teacher of the scriptures in Jewish society. So his upbringing was very strong as far as what Paul was.
Could it be the parents bought their citizenship before Paul was born?
Could what?
Could it be that the parents, Paul's parents, mother and father, bought their citizenship?
It could have been they bought their citizenship as well.
Seems that Paul came to a wealthy family.
That could have been, they could have been a rich family to start with and then had enough money to go purchase their citizenship. That could have been the way it was done as well. Or at least one of them could have purchased it, and then the other, they got the permission to marry and like that. But it did, you look at the rights of the ordinary citizens up there. You have the right not to be tortured, which means if you weren't a citizen, they could torture you all they wanted. Freely conduct commerce. If you were a citizen, you couldn't do that. Right to prosecute or defend yourself. Remember, Paul was just thrown in jail. And he said, "Can you do this to a Roman citizen?" They went, "What? You're a Roman citizen? Oh, I bought mine." Paul says, "I was born a Roman citizen."
How could he prove it?
Huh?
How could he prove that he was a Roman citizen?
I imagine there was something that they had that showed that they were indeed a Roman citizen, considering it was as small a population it was, and this was a big bone of contention between the Roman rulers, the prefects, and the Jews that led up to the uprising going into 70 AD and the destruction of basically Israel as a country, is because they wanted to have those ordinary citizen rights and they didn't have them. And it's something that kept fermenting in society, and they kept fighting and protesting and everything about it. And eventually that's where the Romans said, enough is enough, and they just squashed them. Libertini, those were freed slaves. They made up much of the bureaucracy of the empire, and the empire needed skilled individuals to run it. They were automatically considered a part of the former master's household, but they weren't master slave. They were client and patron. So they were free, they were a patron, but they were still part of the household. If their masters were a citizen, which is kind of interesting, any children the freedmen had would be citizens as well. So there was a big benefit to those particular freed slaves, and you can kind of see why they worked into the bureaucracy. Why would they make up a lot of the bureaucracy? They were educated. They were educated. It's a small group that were the Libertini, which is kind of liberty, but Libertini. But they were educated. They needed them in order to conduct commerce, collect taxes, all those other things that had to be done as part of the bureaucracy in the empire. The slaves had very few rights. They could take their masters to court and earn freedom if they were really badly mistreated. Couldn't be mutilated without cause. Be freed if their master had abandoned them, and killing one's own slave was considered murder. So they couldn't just arbitrarily kill them. But that mistreatment would have to be really, really, really bad. Raping one's own slave, forcing them to become a prostitute, was considered acceptable and ordinary in the Roman society. So what restrictions were there for the slave master? Excuse me? They couldn't kill him. That's about it. I mean, mistreatment, and it's like, who's gonna bring you to court on that particular one? So they didn't have a lot of rights. You can see why Spartacus led that slave revolt. That was just before Caesar Augustus took power. So I'm going to go through and talk about some of those as far as where Paul talks about a slave. But this is in the Roman Empire. So this would be Gentiles mostly and Jews that were in the empire. And I'm going to get to why I'm talking about those. And where I talk about it, where pointed out in blue is a slave, and then what was going on as far as a slave. Yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. So he's talking to people in Corinth. Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you. But if you get a chance to be free, take it. And remember, if you were a slave when the Lord called you, you are now free in the Lord. And if you were free when the Lord called you, you are now a slave to Christ. God paid a price for you, so don't be enslaved by the world. Each of you, dear brothers and sisters, should remain as you were when God first called you. So what does he mean if you get a chance to be free, take it?
I guess it's what if you get a chance, whether it's by working for it or purchasing it.
Or purchasing
Not
it?
to try and run away. That wasn't.
He's not saying run away. If you get a chance to run away, not what he's saying. What he's saying is if you get a chance to somehow purchase it, your master says, I'm going to let you go. No, God said I need to stay a slave. He says, no. That's Paul saying, you're missing the point. Your point is you came in at a certain position in society, stay in that position. But if things change, and you can move out of that particular position, particularly with a slave position, do it. I'm not telling you to stay there forever. I'm just telling you not to revolt against it. And he's making this point in the passage with reference to slave. What's his point? What's his main point with this one that Paul's talking about? Who's the real relationship he's really talking about?
I think he's saying worldly things don't really matter because once you become with God, then that's what matters in the end.
That's the relationship he's talking about. The relationship between you and God. How is that like a slave? Because we're children of God. So what view of that relationship is like a master and a slave?
We were bought with a price. Christ died for us.
Christ died for us. Yeah. So that we become children. But how is that relationship like a master and a slave?
We were created.
We were created.
We're servants.
We're servants.
It's a servitude of love instead of a servitude of ruling over.
That's true. It's a servitude that we voluntarily go into. And if I get to it, I probably won't today. Doug gets to talk about it next week. Is the relationship as far as the servitude and going into that relationship voluntarily that the Jews did. There was that provision of the Jews where they could go into that relationship voluntarily. But even Christ, from a standpoint to the Father to the Son, was in that master-slave relationship because he said, not your will be done, but mine. God's will is absolute. And from that standpoint, we don't have an input. Only from that standpoint that I can see, but we don't have an input. So I got a bunch more of these. This one in Ephesians and the one in Colossians next are a whole lot alike. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with due respect and fear. Serve them sincerely, as you would serve Christ. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. As slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all your hearts. That's kind of what I was just talking about. Work with enthusiasm as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will reward each one of us for the good we do, whether we are slaves or free. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them. Remember, you both have the same master in heaven, and he has no favorites. So what does Paul encourage those who are in that position of being a slave to do? Their best, yeah. Do their best. Be sincere about what you do it and everything like that, because you're still this representative of Christ and God here on this earth. You may have an impact on your master you don't know of. But what does he admonish the master? How does he admonish the masters? Same way. Same way. Yeah. What he's trying to do is move them into this, from this temporal, worldly master-slave relationship to the spiritual God to his children relationship. He's trying to move them over there and saying, this is the way you ought to act. Both sides.
It's like the situation that you're in does not matter. It only matters with, well, you can look at it as lemonade or a lemon.
True.
Yeah.
That's true.
And you just make the best of it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you treat the slaves with deep respect, maybe not fear, your relationship is one of sincerity with them. You're trying your best to provide them the best life they can have. That's what he's looking for. That's what Paul's admonishing the ones in Ephesus to do. Go ahead, Clive.
I don't know if you're going to get there, but he made it even clearer in Philemon.
I'm going to get there.
You're getting there.
I'm going to get there.
Okay.
And like I said, this passage out of Colossians is almost the same. You know, and Colossae was written a little bit after Ephesus when he wrote that particular letter. But again, he says, obey your masters in everything, please them all the time, serve them sincerely, work willingly at whatever you do. But the masters, be just and fair to your slaves. So you can kind of see it's similar. One of them is don't be bad to them on the one for the Ephesus. It says be fair and just. Do what's right by them, which is in stark contrast to the way the Romans treated their slaves. They were tools. And that relationship in some of those was a close relationship. But in most of them, you were a slave. They did whatever they wanted. They just couldn't kill you.
I have a quick question. Does this kind of fold into the, like, because you're Christian, you're supposed to be leading other people to Christ. If your master is not a Christian, if you're treating him poorly, he's not going to want to follow your lead into your beliefs if you're treating him poorly, and likewise the other way around.
Yeah, if he sees he or she, either one could have been, but if they see a stark contrast the way my slaves work for me in the relationship I have with them, and they're so different than these over here, that's going to have an impact. That's going to, he's going to look at it and says, why are you like that? You know, which is kind of the way we are in this world, is how we act around everybody else, what we do. People may say, you're crazy to do that. Well, that's fine. You know, I help somebody that needs help, you know, buy a car or go over there and do stuff for them and stuff like that. We do those kinds of things all the time for each other. And the guy says, you guys do a lot of stuff for each other. And it's like, yeah, because we're all in it together. Okay? And we're all serving our master in heaven. And you can get into that discussion, and I'm sure that's part of what Paul's doing here as well. Philemon, as Clive was talking about. I wanted to keep him here with me while in these chains for preaching the good news, and he would have helped me on your behalf. But I didn't want to do anything without your consent. I wanted to help because you were willing, not because you were forced. It seems you lost Onesimus for a little while so that you could have him back forever. He is no longer like a slave to you. He is more than a slave, for he is a beloved brother, especially to me. Now, he will mean much more to you, both as a man and as a brother in the Lord. So, if you consider me your partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it, and I won't mention that you owe me in your very soul. So it's kind of interesting what Paul adds there at the very end. He says, all this, I'll do this for you, but you do owe me for your soul. You know that, right? So who and what is Onesimus? Yeah, he ran away. For whatever reason, from Philemon, he ran away. And he ended up in Rome. And he's a slave. So he's a runaway slave. And he came to find Christ through Paul. And he stayed there and really helped Paul. So what's Paul concerned about? What's Paul going to do? What is he concerned about?
Him being punished and mistreated.
Onesimus, he's concerned about him doing the right things. What's he saying?
But he's also concerned about him being punished and mistreated.
Yeah, he's sending Onesimus back. And he's concerned what Philemon may do to Onesimus. And if Onesimus was one of the prime slaves he had, and it cost him money, what's Paul say?
He'll cover it.
I'll cover it. I'll pay for it. So we'll just take that off the table. But he sends him back. We don't hear anything. Paul makes it at the end as well. He says, I write this with my own hand, which means most of his letters, I think Galatians he wrote with his own hand. He wrote this one with his own hand. He didn't do a lot with his own hand. Now, whether Paul had poor eyesight, which is what most people have surmised, whether he just didn't, he wasn't very good with his control with his hands, but he was a tent maker. That takes a lot of work with your hands, so it might have been his eyesight was poor. We don't really know. So, in Timothy, all slaves should show full respect for their masters so they will not bring shame on the name of the God and his teaching. If the masters are believers, that is no excuse for being disrespectful. Those slaves should work all the harder because their efforts are helping other believers who are well loved. So, what does Paul tell Timothy about how the relationship is between slaves and masters? You're supposed to respect him and not disdain him. For what reason?
Well, they're a witness. Witness to.
Well, don't bring shame on the name of God and his teaching. In other words, he's writing to slaves who are Christians. And you may be in a bad situation. You may have a bad master. It doesn't matter, is what he's trying to say. Timothy was written later. All these particular books that I've got here that I'm showing are in succession to time. So it was still, even in late, when Paul was writing these letters, he was still saying the same thing. So, now we're going to look at Jewish society. And we played Tennessee. I should have made that color rather than orange, another color. Because they won in overtime. But you have really kind of three breakdowns of the people in Jewish society. And most of them are just the ordinary Jews. There is a ruling class that's elite, and then there's a slave population, but it's smaller, much smaller. And it's much different. And I think Doug's going to get to talk about that next week because I'm not going to get to that this week. But a couple questions. Dominant class in Jewish society. Rank and file, ordinary Jew. What are the differences and similarities between Jewish society and Roman society?
Slave population is much less.
Much less. The ruling elite class is probably comparable as far as size, but it's inclusive. In a Roman society, you had the slaves, you had the peregrini, and you had the ordinary citizens. Those three classes together was almost all the society, but they were all different. They had different rights, they had different capabilities. But the Jewish population, the ordinary Jews, that was what everybody was. So who do you think comprises the ruling and the elite class? Teachers? Pharisees and Sadducees. What portion of Jewish society was Jesus in? Ordinary Jews. So a little bit more about these. 4 major schools. The Pharisees, they began as sages and scribes of the Torah, but they were the ones who developed the Mishnah, which was the oral traditions, or the oral Torah. In other words, the interpretation was there. And the Gemara, which is the interpretation of the interpretation with commentaries on the Mishnah and what it meant. So you had all those rules. Those were from the Pharisees. They came out of the sages and scribes that started when the Jews came back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. They generally received the backing of Jewish society. The ordinary Jew was more open and would follow the Pharisees more than the Sadducees. And they were the dominant Jewish sect that survived the destruction of Jerusalem. The only one of the sects that survived the destruction of Israel, basically, but Jerusalem itself. So the Sadducees, they developed from the priests and the allied elites that were with the priests, rigid adherence to the Old Testament and Torah. In other words, the Mishnah and the Gemara, they didn't go along with that. They said, only what's in the scripture, which is kind of interesting that they would have the view that they had as far as the afterlife. They ceased to exist following the destruction of Jerusalem, which kind of makes sense because they were in and around running the temple, and the temple had been totally destroyed. Zealots, revolutionaries dedicated to separation from Rome, crushed by the Romans in 70 AD. These would have been the ones that would have been constantly pushing to say, push Rome out. Let's violently attack them. Let's kill a Roman soldier if we can. That would be a good thing. Let's constantly ferment trouble and problems in the province. And the Essenes, they were apolitical. They were a sect of dissident priests that weren't really part of the Sadducees. They ceased to exist also following the destruction of Jerusalem. So, a list that kind of just compares those two. I thought this was a nice table that was in there. The Pharisee, they represented the common man. Everybody, the ordinary Jew, was more aligned to the Pharisee. The Sadducee was the ruling class. They ran the temple. They did all that was in that part of it. The Pharisee believed in the rabbinic interpretations as well as the Torah. The interpretations would have been the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Sadducees, only the written word. Nothing that was interpretation. Pharisee was popular, democratic. Sadducee was conservative and aristocratic and monarchist. So they had a very much autocratic style. The Pharisee was, for some reason, considered the most expert and accurate discussers of the law. And the Sadducee was expert in Torah. So you kind of see where where the Pharisee was a lawyer. They would take what the law was, but then they would interpret it, and then interpret it. The Pharisee extended the purity laws, you know, how you clean, the special way where you washed your hands and you held them up and the water dripped from the end of your elbow. They held those up outside of the temple. But the Pharisees, the Sadducees, only in the temple. Only in temple worship and what you did there. They didn't hold it outside of the temple. And that's one of those ones where the Pharisees were accusing Christ to say, you don't wash your hands before you eat. It's like, that was a purity law to be applied in the temple. Well, the Pharisees didn't stop there. They applied it everywhere. Pharisees interpret the Torah literally. In other words, the liberal interpretation was to say, yeah, but we're going to make this loophole. Okay? One of the loopholes they had with Christ was they said, well, the Torah says you're supposed to honor your mother and father. When they get old, you're supposed to take care of them. But if you give a lot of money to the temple, you don't have to do that. That was a loophole. That was a liberal interpretation of the Torah. The Sadducees said, you have to take care of your parents. So there was a big difference there. Pharisee believed in resurrection of the dead in the future, messianic age, literal resurrection of the body. What they had, it disappeared with the temple as far as the Sadducee. The Pharisee believed in free will, but God has foreknowledge of human destiny. What's going to happen in the future? Obviously with the prophets, that's where that would have come from. The Sadducee was much more conservative. You can see everything in the Sadducee is much more conservative. Only what I can see and touch will I really believe. Because they believed in free will, but that was kind of where it stopped. And the big one we always talk about is the Pharisee believed in the afterlife. The Sadducee says, when you're dead, you're dead. There is no afterlife. And that's why we have the little thing to say, how do you tell the difference between a Pharisee and a Sadducee? Well, the Sadducee is sad because he doesn't believe afterlife, so he's sad, you see.
So, thank you for this slide. This is really helpful because I never understood quite what the differences are. So if you were an ordinary Jew in society, like, where did you fall? Who did you follow and what
They were
dictated that?
They were more aligned to the Pharisees.
Okay.
But this is the ruling class. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were the elite ruling class of Jewish society.
But if I'm just the ordinary Jew, which belief system do I generally fall under?
You're going to normally go to the Pharisee because you like the loopholes.
Okay. Got it.
I honestly think that's the reason they went to that particular one, was they liked the loopholes. Okay, they had more flexibility. Let's talk about it. Okay, this is what God says, but let's work it, especially if you could contribute a little bit of money. We'll work it so that you can be okay with God and you'll feel good about it.
And were they both in the temple together?
The Sadducees were really the ones who ran the temple.
Okay.
And most of those should have been Levites, but they weren't. Sadducee was a philosophy, was an approach, as you can see. With the Pharisee, it was a different philosophy. Both of them were based on the Torah, based on the scriptures. But the ones who were very liberal about it were the Pharisees. So, I'll get to one of them. I have 35 slides. I only got to 15, so you've got something to work with next week. So, but when he saw many Pharisees and Sadducees coming to watch him baptize, he denounced them. You brood of snakes, he explained. Who warned you to flee the coming wrath? Prove by the way you live that you have repented of your sins and turned to God. Don't just say to each other, we're safe, for we are descendants of Abraham. That doesn't mean anything. For I tell you, God can create children of Abraham from these very stones. And now the axe of God's judgment is poised, ready to sever the roots of the trees. Yes, every tree that does not produce good fruit will be chopped down and thrown into the fire. So this is the first exposure that we have in Matthew to what God thinks of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And my color coding is to the chart that we had as far as what the explanation where they were. So how did John the Baptist respond when they showed up? A brood of vipers or a brood of snakes.
He took
Well, yeah, he said, your birthright doesn't mean a thing. You think you're safe? I think I asked that one. Yeah, what gave them confidence they were right with God is to say, well, we can trace our ancestry all the way back to Abraham, and we're safe because of that. He says, Matter of fact, Paul makes that point, is to say, in his books that he writes, he says, you're children of Abraham spiritually. You Jews, you keep looking at it to say, oh, I'm a child of Abraham. These people are children of Abraham because they're following God. You're not. You need to be over here. So he makes that contrast. And I think that was the second bell, wasn't it? Doug? Steve? Okay. So Doug will, if he wishes, he can pick up here next week and talk. I have several scriptures about the Pharisees and Sadducees, and I have several scriptures where it talks about a slave in Jewish society, which is really different than a slave in Roman society. Thank you.